You're listening to The Novice Experience, a podcast that explores the opportunities and challenges commonly encountered by students and young people. I'm Calvin Chan, and chatting with my guests, I'm going to take a deep dive into their meaningful stories, the lessons they've learned, and how they can inspire others. Let's get going. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Novice Experience. I'm your host, Calvin Chan. Today, my guest is Hsieh. He is the host and producer of the Uncooked Rice Show, a podcast that explores the journeys, experiences, and insights of Gen Z Asian Americans. He is currently a student at Carleton University, located in Ottawa, Canada, and is studying for his Bachelor of Public Affairs and Policy Management, majoring in economic policy and minoring in psychology. Hi, Jesse. Welcome to the show.
Hello, Calvin. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be on here.
I'm really excited to have you today because your podcast is really closely related to this show because you really focus on young people and you talk about the experiences and the stories of being a young adult and student in North America and what that feels like. And you're focusing on specifically, Asian people as well. So that's very interesting. I know that we're going to find a lot of synergy between our podcasts. But before we start, I'd like to ask for a brief origin story. So, where you're from, your background, and some of the most defining experiences that make up who you are today.
Right. Origin story. I really like that term. Makes me feel like a hero, I guess. Makes my life feel more special than it actually feels like, right? So for me, my name is Hsieh. I am a Taiwanese Canadian. My parents and I immigrated to Canada, to Vancouver, BC, when I was roughly like 3 or 4. For me, I think some of the most defining moments in my life were, I guess, subtle moments, I'd say. Like, I know a lot of people have these very, um, I guess, big, flashy moments where, they might have like a sudden, I guess, spark in their life. But for me, it's always been subtle moments that have had a bigger effect or bigger impact on my life, right? And for me, it was always about life lessons that I've learned. And so for that, to answer your question, I feel like these moments would probably be when I started getting more involved into trying to figure out what my heritage means, right? What my Asian culture means for my own identity. I think that plus when I first, I guess, stepped into more leadership positions, did that have a bigger impact on my life? Because for me, I've always been I guess, a person who liked exploring interests, but it wasn't until I stepped into leader positions, whether it's in my school or community, did I realize that being involved in teamwork, being involved in, helping mentoring other students and other kids, did I realize that this was something that I was passionate about, something that I was interested in. And then lastly, of course, it's definitely starting my podcast, I'd say, that has really helped define who I am and try to, push for more exploration of who I am as a person, individual, and as an Asian Canadian, I'd say.
When you say subtle moments, what was one of the most significant subtle moments that really made you, identify with your heritage?
I think that's a good question. For me, it was more so that one day, I think, after a few years of, you know, um, I guess in a sense, internalized hatred for being Asian, because I grew up sort of stuck between two worlds where, my family was very traditionally Chinese, right? We
Mhm.
didn't have a lot of westernized friends or close family friends. And so I went home, speaking Mandarin, engaging in a lot of Chinese traditions and heritage. But when I went to school, on the other hand, I was surrounded by friends who were mostly westernized, people who've lived here for a few generations now. And so trying to find that balance was difficult for me. And so I think um, it wasn't until I think, slowly started to realize that who I am as a person isn't really defined by that discourse between those two cultures, but rather, I guess, a culmination of the two. Did I start to really be more comfortable with who I am and who my identity was in terms of what my culture was?
Yeah, definitely really relatable to me as well. I felt like perhaps I was hiding sort of the Chinese heritage, but as I got older and as I matured, I started sharing some of the some of the lessons and the traditional learnings from my heritage with other people, in the workplace and at school. And it was really cool to be able to combine sort of the traditional way of thinking, but also the Western and the new lessons that I've learned and I've picked up in society. So, yeah, you're really right. Like it really becomes a culmination of both cultures together that make up who we are. And I'm sure we're going to get back to that more in later in the episode. But I'd like to move on to our segment called "Give Me Five," which is a lightning round of questions. And you can give short or long answers. You don't have to explain or elaborate your answers, but it just helps our listeners get to know you more. So, question number one: if you could have an unlimited amount of something, what would it be?
Uh, a limited amount of something. I think a limited amount of um, oh, airplane tickets. I
Okay.
think that for me is really something that I would like because um, as a, as I'm trying to explore more of my Asian culture, I think I'll try to tie it back to the whole Asian culture thing. It's as I'm trying to explore more of who I am as a person, I've come to realize that it's been difficult. It was difficult when I was growing up trying to figure that out because I was so, I guess, enclosed in a few small specified environments, right? And I only had those few sources, like those one or two sources where I could draw upon, I guess, an understanding of what being Chinese meant or being Canadian meant, right? And it wasn't until I started meeting more people, meeting more perspectives, did I realize that there is so much more for me to learn, so much more for me to understand and develop, right? And so, if
Yeah.
I had an unlimited amount of airplane tickets, I feel like I could travel the world, meet new people, draw on more inspirations from different sources that don't just confine me to a certain understanding of or a certain, I guess, paper perspective of something, right?
Wow, that's really deep. Well, following up, what's a city you wish to visit then?
Ooh, um, I have actually been talking to a friend about this recently, just because of COVID. We've all been trapped, right? And
Yeah.
because of lockdown, and so we were talking about places to visit. And I think for me, um, I would definitely like to visit, I guess, Italy. I think,
Mhm.
because for me, I've traveled a lot around different Asian countries, like Philippines, Japan, Taiwan, and so um, I'd like to explore more of, I guess, southern and sort of western Europe as well, just
Yep.
because there's so much more perspective I feel like I could learn from that.
Right on. Good. When are you the most productive?
When I feel pressured to be productive, which is yeah, I am a naturally lazy person, and
Yeah. Yeah.
I procrastinate too much, I feel like. And so I feel like a lot of people can relate to this, but it's not
Yep.
until like I feel like I have to do something do I, force myself to actually do it, right? Um,
Hmm.
it obviously is a habit that I'm trying to get rid of, but I there's a saying that I like to say that I joke around with. It's like, um, if there's only a minute left of something, you'll finish it in a minute, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, we speak in terms of the laws of physics, right? F equals to ma. So,
Yeah.
without force and pressure, you won't be moving. So, yeah, pressure. People work differently, but I also felt like working under pressure really makes me the most productive too. What's your go-to comfort food?
Nachos.
Ooh,
Yes.
nice. Have you had a lot of that over COVID shutdown?
I have, yes. It's just, bags of chips at home with cheese and tomatoes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. It's been a long year, Jesse, in 2020, but looking ahead, what's one goal you'd like to achieve heading into the new year?
Definitely making more connections. I think, especially in university, and I think you'll find this very common among university students, especially first years. Um, it's that COVID has really put a restriction or a confinement on making new friends. Um, and, as I guess people feel more pressured to get ahead in, I guess, the career or their university path, a lot of it comes down to making connections, and that's something that I would like to improve on in the upcoming year, if COVID allows, of course. But
Yeah, fantastic. And we'll get into more of that later on too. Maybe you have some insight and advice on how to, build up relationships with other people. But yeah, like I said earlier, you're studying economic policy as part of your Bachelor of Public Affairs and Policy Management in our nation's capital, Ottawa. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you got into the school, Carleton University, and also this program?
Right. So, um, when I was, I guess, in high school, still trying to figure out what I wanted to do for university, I was sort of had a list of options, but I never really knew which one to go into. And I knew I had an interest in specific fields like psychology, politics, history, a little bit of business too, and finance. But I never could figure out what exactly it is that I wanted to pursue. Like especially since university, you basically have 4 years of your life planned out, and you have to pay for tuition, right? So it was a big
Yeah.
decision. Um, and I think sometime in grade 11, late grade 10, a friend actually came up to me and they had heard of this program at Ottawa at Carleton, and they thought I'd be interested in it. And turns out I did some researching. It was fortunately enough, it was like a perfect fit for what I was interested in, right? And it just sparked, I guess, something in me, and it just clicked. In terms of, did you want to know more of like the technical aspects of how I got in, or was it just that?
Well, I wanted to know more about the personal aspects. So
Right.
how did you decide to apply for this program? What happened? What sparked your interest? And also moving away from home, right? Obviously, you're taking a risk as a young student to be independent and moving to the other side of the country. How did all of that come together?
Right. Um, I'll start by, I guess, saying I knew very early on that I wanted to move out. Um,
Okay,
and I think for me, it was always been like, if I was able to move out, it would be much easier for me to move back to Vancouver with my family compared to if I stayed in Vancouver, right? Because if I stayed, I most likely would have never have left. And that
right.
to me, I think, was like, I guess a big help towards deciding my university, because for me moving out was always the main goal because I wanted to meet new people, right? I knew like Vancouver, as big as it is, there's only so much you can do, right? um, I think moving out definitely opened up more doors, more opportunities for me, so that was a big draw. In terms of Carleton itself and the program itself, with research I found out that not only was the program pretty flexible, it was definitely really structured compared to most, which is a big contradiction if you think about it. But for me, I think I was always scared of the idea of not knowing what to do. Like I have
Right.
this, I guess, control issue in a way where I want to feel more like I'm in control of my life.
Yeah.
And so going in, like thinking about university, it was like I didn't really want to go into just a general arts degree and sort of having to pick out what I want by picking out the courses and then figuring out later on what I want, right? So I've always
Mm.
wanted to figure out exactly what I wanted to do, or like a pretty structured sense of direction before I headed into university. And the program itself managed let me do that because of it. Well, one, because of its structure, but also two, because of its history. So it has a history of having really good co-op percentages, where most of
Mhm.
the students there get co-op jobs, and it's co-op jobs that really fit in with the program itself. So that was a big draw towards it.
Obviously, you wanted to be as specific as possible,
Yeah,
in picking a program. So, as part of having control over what you want to do, what if there are some young students who aren't entirely sure of what they even like and run the risk of drilling down to a program that's too specific, and then when they're in, they realize that they don't like what they're studying, and then
right.
it's hard to transfer to another program. Do you run the risk of going too specific?
I I think definitely yes. There's always going to be extreme ends of situations where it's always going to have a more negative impact than anything, right? I think like anything, picking your university degree, it's a big decision, and there's always definitely going to be an issue of finding balance between being too specific or being too flexible, right? Um, I guess some advice would be is definitely doing research. It's like the best I could offer, because what I looked into, like the specific requirements that I looked to when I was researching my program was one, what does this program really focus on? So this program focuses on political science specifically and policy. But
Hmm.
the second thing I looked for was what are some alternatives to it? What are some, back backdoor opportunities, I guess I could
Hmm.
say, that could lead to other fields of study if this program didn't work out right. So I looked
Yeah.
into that, and the program, luckily enough, had even more specializations in it. So I think you could study economic policy, which is what I'm doing. You would also study international relations or social policy or communications, and so that to me was interesting because it had structure, but it also had flexibility. I think if different kids in high school are looking into programs, you definitely want to try to find programs that, you know, have a specific focus, but definitely don't limit you, right? So you want to have programs that branch out to other fields of study too. If structure is something that scares you, being too structured, and you're afraid that, if you go into the program after a few years, you might not actually want to be in that program, then definitely looking for alternatives or programs that focus more on a broad approach is definitely something that you should look into, right?
Yeah, that's fantastic. I feel like it was nice because you knew what you liked and what you gravitated towards, and you just had to connect that with the opportunities available in different schools. Um, but my question is, how can young people and young students figure out what they're truly passionate about? And the word "truly" is really important because I feel like a lot of people they get pressured into specific things to like. So, for example, like a doctor, like the typical, professions, right? Doctor, lawyer, engineer, and then they feel like they like it, and then they realize they don't when they're actually in the program. And I say that because, um, I only studied engineering because I gravitated towards it, thinking that it was a cool profession. You get a license, and it's held in um, high honor in history and society because engineers are, they invent the world, and I thought that it was something that was really cool. I wouldn't say that I knew too much about it, but I was lucky because once I started studying it, I liked it more and more. I knew that I always liked studying math and physics in high school, so that helped. Um, but I wouldn't say I was like truly, truly like passionate about it. I knew that I was going to do it for my entire life, right? Going into post secondary. Um, so for high schoolers, how do they figure out what they're truly, truly passionate about, Jesse?
I'd say that's a tough question because my perspective on that question would be, everyone's interest changes from time to time. Definitely over your whole life, you will have certain peaks and moments, where you might be extremely interested in one thing, but later on it might fizzle out, or, it might not, you might be more interested in something else, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so the way I've gone about tackling that issue is I've always tried to look at it in the long term. Um, and I guess it's a more fortunate way of looking at it. But for me, I've always had a more, um, I guess, ambitious perspective on life where I knew that I have this whole life ahead of me, right? Like my life isn't just limited to the 4 years of university. And then after university, after I get my degree, I'm like limited to this one job, depending on what my university degree is, right? For me, it's always been if I go into one direction that I'm interested in now, study it, and then do a little bit of it in the future, like whatever career path that my university degree allows me to do, I still have so much more time in my life to be able to study other things too, right?
Hmm.
I think a lot of misconception about university and about higher education is that um, people think that you can only have one degree in your life, or like you can only study one thing in your life, and you're restricted to that for the rest of your life. But that's not entirely true, right? Especially with online courses now, and the internet being so extremely useful. There's so many different ways you can learn new skills and explore new talents and new hobbies that you might enjoy. For high school kids, especially, um, if you haven't done extracurriculars, if you haven't tried out a lot of different courses at your school, you know, I think I would recommend going online, looking up things, um, like online courses, like online videos that sort of touch on what a certain study actually does or what it actually learned from it, right? And
Hmm.
beyond that too, I would also say try to reach out to people who are in that profession too, because the best way to learn about something, especially if it's a field of study, is definitely talking to people who've actually been through that field of study too, right?
Hmm. Jesse, I really like the fact that you put the responsibility back onto the individual when you give this advice. I think a lot of young students, when they're struggling with, what they're really passionate about and what to study, some people tend to blame the environment that they're in. The school system or the teachers, and their parents or family. But I like how all the advice that you give is really individualized. It's internal. You have to do more work to learn about what's available, do more research because the internet is readily available.
Yeah,
And I feel like that's really good advice because at the end of the day, it's just you and yourself. Like your path and your journey isn't the responsibility of someone else's, and you really have to take charge.
yep,
And secondly, I think that, and you're right, like people need to be open minded about what they'll end up doing because it sucks. People view that the 4 years of university or college is it's sort of like set in stone, like the rest of their life, right? The rest of their life, what they're gonna do, it's decided by these 4 years, and I feel like that's a really scary notion, because, like you said, people change, passions change, interests change, circumstances change. You can't have 4 years of schooling determine what you're going to do for the rest of your life. So I think you and I have a really similar value, and that's lifelong learning, right? That you always be a student of life and the journey that you're on, and understanding that you can do whatever you want, as long as you overcome that fear and uncertainty to go try it out. And I feel like that's such a beautiful thing because if life was just set in stone and we determine um, if we determine decades of our lives just from the 4 years, then there's really no meaning to living your life fully, right?
yeah, exactly. And I think a lot of students, especially like high school students and younger students, think that way is because they've only known they've only been alive for like 19 years going into university, or 18 years, and so 4 years to them, 4 years to the 18 years that they've been alive, it's quite an enormous amount of time, right?
Hmm.
But if you look forward in time, you have probably, hopefully, luckily enough, maybe you'll live up to 100 years old. 4 years is not a lot compared to that amount of time, right?
This year you became a writer for the Kroger Policy Review, which is a youth-led digital publication that makes public policy content more understandable for Canadians. How has this experience been for you so far?
It's been great. It's a student, I guess, led organization that we just started this year, and
Hmm.
so I was lucky enough to be asked on to the team as a contributing writer, by uh, one of the co-founders, right? And so that was something that I wanted to explore more, and because even though that I'm currently studying economic policy, there is so much that I haven't learned, especially since I'm only just starting into second year, right? So I figured that would be a good opportunity for me to learn not just from other writers, but definitely upper years too, on their experiences, on their lessons that they learned throughout university and their careers too.
Hmm. And obviously, this is sort of an extracurricular for you. Why is it important for you to sort of participate in this publication, where you're sort of having this creative outlet as well, right? Based on what you're studying in terms of policy, um, and what's happening in our country. Why is it important for you to really connect with the community around you through writing?
I think for me, it's writing has always been something that I'm passionate about. Um, that being said, of course, like writing for university courses is another beast to tackle that I'm not exactly the best at. But I think writing for me has always been a way of expressing my thoughts in a sense. So going back to your question, I think participating in the extracurricular was important to me because education is, for me, I think, is not enough. Personally, I think if you stand by and just do the bare minimum, you're not going to get far in life. And so for me, the idea of extracurriculars is really beneficial for students, especially not just in university, but in high school too, right? It's because extracurriculars help you provide other opportunities for you to learn other lessons that you're not going to learn in high school or school in general.
Hmm.
That's why I like to explore these, I guess, opportunities, because there's just so much you can learn from that's not defined by a certain, I guess, course syllabus, right? There's so many different soft skills and technically hard skills too that you can learn from, not just from the work that you put out there while you're doing that extracurricular, but also the lessons you can learn from the people also involved.
For sure. Yeah, and I totally agree. For me, the the for me, the most value that I got in terms of schooling was through extracurricular activities. Ironically, because it really challenged me in terms of applying my values and skills to that particular thing that I was doing. Whereas school was really spoon feeding the theory and what you need to know. So through extracurriculars, that's where I really noticed where my strengths and weaknesses are, where I learned more about myself, and how I worked in a team, what I liked and what I disliked. And I found that very, very valuable because just sitting in a classroom won't tell you about yourself. You'll feel really crappy when you get a bad exam mark and when you're struggling with the material, but that's not really learning about who you truly are and what you're truly passionate about. And so
Exactly.
that's why I value participating in stuff outside of school.
Yeah, exactly. And I would
Mhm.
ask, I guess, Calvin,
Mhm.
what sort of extracurriculars, I guess, help push you towards your choice of education?
Well, one of the most defining moments, well, it's not even a moment, it's close to a decade, is spending 7 years in the Air Cadets program. And for those who don't know, it's sort of like a youth organization uh, administered by the Department of National Defense, where they teach young students, about Canadian values, about the military, and about leadership. And I was an air cadet, so aviation as well. And that's where I really got the opportunity to participate in a team. It was like 200 people in our unit, but also eventually become a leader, become squadron commander, and really seeing the big picture of how to manage an organization. Of course, in a micro way, and also really exploring the aviation side of things. And that's where I decided to go earn my pilot's license, flying a Cessna 172. And as I was flying, I was like, well, I might as well go learn about the airplane, how all the engine and everything works, how the aerodynamic works. So I decided to apply for engineering with a goal of studying mechanical engineering in mind. And so that to me is how I decided to go into engineering. And that wasn't through, classroom exercises at all. It was through meeting people, other people who's passionate about aviation, getting opportunities in the Air Cadet program, to run events, to manage a team, that sort of stuff where I learned about my interpersonal skills and values. So, to your question, that's how I related what I learned about myself in the extracurriculars back to what I want to study in university. We're nearing the tail end of part one of our conversation in this episode. To end off, I wanted to ask for students that are currently in grade 10, 11, or maybe even grade 12, right? They're about to apply to college. What are the steps that they need to take? Like for someone who's maybe they're unsure, they're in grade 10 or 11, they're unsure that what they're passionate about, what they want to study. Where do they start?
I think the first step is, if you haven't already, definitely try to figure out what your interests are. Right, that's the biggest thing that you need to know. Is, I think, personally, like, you have to understand what it is you're interested in before you start looking into the different types of programs you want to get into and the different type of universities you want to apply to. Right, because if you don't know what you want to do, what's the point? Right, why would you necessarily want to spend I guess thousands of dollars and, I guess, years of your time going into a degree or a program that you might not end up using or want to go into, right? I think that's the thing that I have issue with, that with the current system of education, I guess, it's that kids these days feel so pressured just by, society, different by their peers, as well as, the past uh, alumni of their school, that they have to go into university to succeed at life. And that to me is really upsetting in a way, because you see so many kids going into programs and then realizing that this is not something that I want to do for the rest of their life, right? And so if you haven't already, go find extracurriculars, go out and search for them, either in your school or your community, different clubs, different youth programs, different youth organizations, to help you try to expand your own understanding of the world and what your own hobbies, passions, and interests are, right? Beyond that, it's not just about participating in these clubs. It's also about the people too. There's so many different people you can meet in your life, so many different people out on the internet, on LinkedIn, Facebook, just around the world, your school alumni too. And so many of these different people have their own stories and their own experiences that I'm pretty sure they're more than happy to share with you, right? And so with that, I'm not saying that, going into extracurriculars or talking to people is going to very much so help you decide what you want to do, but it definitely opens up the opportunity for you to do so, right? It definitely expands the percentage or the chance that you will actually find out what it is you're interested in.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And from my point of view, I think coming up with a game plan, it never hurts to think about your 5 year. I usually do the half decade thing, right? Like think about 5 years ahead, what you want to do, what you want to achieve and know about in the 5 years, because I think that it's important to have a game plan and an exit plan of whatever you're exploring, right? If you're still in grade 10 and you're a couple years away from sending in your applications, I think if you start exploring the really like the different things that you think you're passionate about, it might end up like a crapshoot, right? You're so disorganized, and sometimes you get too busy and you lose interest in many different things altogether.
mm-hmm.
So I think having an exit plan, so like by this day, in 6 months, I want to have more clarity on whether I actually like this thing or not, and then continue or quit from there. So I feel like it's important to think ahead and have a game plan, so that you don't end up feeling like it's all a mess at the end.
Exactly. And it's definitely important in your game plan, especially to list out the resources that you have, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Jesse, thank you so much for spending the time and giving advice for young students who are really exploring their interests right now and thinking about applying to universities and colleges. It's a really important time in our lives. It's life changing. But this is only part one of our conversation. Next week we're gonna come back and talk about relationships. How we go about and meet new people, approach people, and network. As young people, it might be daunting to talk to experienced professionals who are much older than us, and you have some insight on that. And obviously, we're gonna also talk about your podcast, the Uncooked Rice Show, and what we can expect for season 2 of your podcast. So, before we end off, would you like to tell listeners where they can find your podcast social media?
Oh yeah, sure. I'll start with my personal Instagram personal contact information is Jesse J. Hsieh. I'm on Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, so you can find me there. And for my podcast, The Uncooked Rice Show, we're just on Instagram at Uncooked Rice Show.
Perfect. So we'll come back next week and we'll have part 2 of our conversation with Jesse Hsieh. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of The Novice Experience. Our theme song is Concrete Jungle by Audio Binger. You can find us or reach out on social media at The Novice Exp. That's The Novice EXP. Don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review on all your podcast listening platforms. Talk to you next time.